to mute if that's okay. Good. All right. Well, thank you very much for showing up. This is a circumstance where even very icy roads don't prevent people getting to the forum. Today I'm going to talk about a religious tradition which is crucial to American history, which is broadly the evangelical tradition. It shows up in evangelical, Pentecostal, holiness, and aspects of that have been vital to American history at every point. And not just, of course, for white evangelicals. So much of Black American religion, the Black church, is purely evangelical. And there are a series of ideas in that evangelical tradition which emerge at particular moments in history. And what I'm going to do today is do something that when people write the history of American Christianity, they frankly never really pay much attention to. Think of evangelicals. What do you think of? Born again. You think of revivals. You think of these great tent revival meetings. They all had an origin. And here's my point. They had an origin at particular moments in history, which were connected with climate shocks and climate catastrophes. And this is something we haven't seen for a while. It's called the sun. In the 16th and 17th centuries, people started being able to look at the sun, and they found these things called sunspots. And they recorded them, they counted them, and over time, people made an interesting discovery. Sunspots did not just happen randomly. There were some eras when there were a real lot of them, and some when there were very, very few or none. And that corresponded with times when the sun was very active or very inactive. And I'll just show you one thing here. This is 400 years of sunspot observations. And I just want you to look way over to what on my screen is the left, that is the early part of that era in the 17th and late 17th century. And you see the words Maunder Minimum. And for a period of about 60 or 70 years, there are no sunspots. Normally there are several hundred a year, maybe thousands. In this era, there are none. And so from the family, the couple that discovered this, the Maunder family, we call it the Maunder Minimum. And you think, well, gee, that's nice. What does that have to do with religion? That era from 1645 to 1715 is one of the coldest eras in European Northern Hemisphere history. And it's also marked by a series of catastrophes, of famines, of plagues, which reached their height or their depth, if you like, round about the year 1675 through 1680. A horrible, horrible time to be around. When somebody has annoyed you in future, just say, I wish you were alive in 1680. It's the worst thing you can say to them. So when people are starving or sick or fearful, what do? Well, they look for scapegoats. They look for people to blame, and there can be many of these. It's one of the great eras of witch persecutions, when people are looking for witchcraft, and the dates are perfect. Sweden, for instance, has this great wave of witch trials from 1675 onwards. 1675 is that key turning point. Different countries persecute different people. In Great Britain, they turn to Catholics, and they execute many Roman Catholic priests for wholly imaginary plots and conspiracies. The picture here is a man called Oliver Plunkett, who was the Catholic primate, the Archbishop of Ireland, one of the most important people in the Catholic world, and he was beheaded and became a saint, and you can see a stained glass window. And this all happens around 1680. And in case you think, well, this is a European thing, no, it happens around the world. If you look at the American Southwest, in what we call New Mexico, from 1675, there begins a period of ferocious drought, famine. People become desperate. Native American people go back to their old gods. They're persecuted for being witches. And in 1680, note the year, they launched the most successful anti-colonial rising in the history of North America when they drive the Spaniards out of New Mexico for about 12 years. Things are bad, things are desperate. Now imagine you're a regular Christian, a thoughtful Christian around this time. Oh, what else could happen? In 1680, not connected with climate, purely coincidence, but try telling that to people at the time, there's a very spectacular comet. And if you don't think the world is ending in 1680, you're not reading the papers. How do people respond from 1675 onwards? Well, many thoughtful Christians devise a new movement. And what they say is, look, the churches are not working. We just go along to church, we listen to sermons, we go through the services. It's not enough. We have to devise something wholly new. And the ideas they have sound so absolutely basic to us, but they're brand new and they seem heretical at the time. What do they think? We have to be born again. You get this brand new idea that emerges in German Protestantism called being born again. People should get together in small groups outside church where pious and holy people should try and encourage each other. And this is put forward in a book which is one of the most influential, actually, in Christian history. It's called Pierdesideria, which is by a man called Philip Spener, a German leader. And from the name of that book, you get a movement called Pietists. And all later evangelical thought grows out of that movement. And on the bottom there, you can see the date, that's 1676. That's not the first edition, it appeared in 1675. But think about it, when you believe the world is going to end, you have to get ready for the end of the world, as is obviously going to happen in this era. What you do, you have to shake up the church. You launch what is basically a new Reformation. I mean, all these guys are Lutherans, but they radically transform the church. And that's going to be so important for us. And what I mean by that is the United States, but also this part of the world. There's Mr. Spener. In his way, he's as important as Martin Luther. And the Pietists come to North America. And there's a great picture of the Pietist missionaries and how they're received by the American Indians and by the settlers. And Pietism is going to be at the ground level of German Protestant Christianity, of German Christianity in Pennsylvania and in the US. But think of those ideas, small groups, born again. Can you think of anything more basic to the evangelical package? Well, I'll give you one other thing, which is kind of interesting. 1679, yet again, you get a revolution by radical Puritans in the nation of Scotland. And they rebel against the Anglican establishment, and they're subject to vicious persecution. So think about it. If you're forbidden from worshiping in the churches, what do? You go out into the fields, and you have these great meetings where you might have thousands of people who gather together and listen to preachers who know they run the risk of being hanged if they're caught. And if that idea seems at all familiar, what that is the first dry run of what Americans are going to call revival meetings, tent meetings, and the revivals that grow in America in the 18th century. And who does those revivals? They're people called the Scotch-Irish, who are the direct descendants of these Scottish Presbyterians who come over to America and come over to places like Pennsylvania. You know, and they have names like Bowl, and they create places like Bowlsburg. So when you look at American revival meetings, you're looking at a tradition which is formed in these bitter and I mean that in every word, bitter years around 1679, field preaching to camp meeting. And there's one other element. In England, they kill Catholics. In France, they kill Protestants. And in the 1680s, the French persecute their Protestants. Those Protestants flee around the world, and they also bring these very radical Protestant messages with them to where? America, Britain, South Africa. And some of them become so fanatical that they develop ideas of apocalypse. They think the end times are happening. And some of them develop an idea which nobody's talked about for about 1,000 years before that. They start speaking in tongues. So when you look at something like Pentecostal movement, you're looking at ideas which originate with some of these groups like the French prophets. So you've got these radical Germans, these radical Irish, these radical French, oh, these strange, bizarre ideas. If only there was somewhere in the world where they could go without the danger of being killed. And they do. They come to Pennsylvania, which is founded in 1682, note the date. And the good thing about all these fanatics and apocalyptic people is a lot of them are really good farmers and traders, and they make Pennsylvania in a few years one of the most prosperous and populous of American colonies. Now think about it. You've got all these ideas which are separate, and maybe people don't initially talk to each other and share these ideas. You've got people over here who believe in being born again. You've got people over here who believe in going out into the fields to preach to people in their thousands. You've got these apocalyptic ideas. Over time, people start talking to each other. They start sharing ideas. And all you need is another crisis to bring things together. And the next time that things are going to be really horribly dreadful is around the year 1740. Well, let me be precise, 1739 to 1742, when the world becomes very, very cold once again, when people are starving in very large numbers. This is a quote from a climate historian, and you can see it yourself. For that period of 21 months, bizarre climatic conditions prevailed across the European continent, also in North America, causing what became known as the British Isles as the Great Frost, which is claimed to have turned Ireland into an Arctic country. Ireland, to take one example, has a famine which kills way more people than the famous potato famine 100 years later. It is an absolutely dreadful time. Okay, well, think about it. How do people respond? And America suffers this horribly. Guess what? There's another big Indian rising in the Southwest, which drives the Spanish out of northern Mexico for a period. What do people think in the American colonies? They're looking for scapegoats. Who do they turn up with? Shall we go against African Americans? Shall we go against Catholics? I know, they think in New York. Let's go against both of them. Let's say that Black Americans, that slaves and freed slaves, are allied with Catholics, and they're planning to burn down the city. They're going to kill all the white people. 1740, 1741, you have some of the worst conspiracy charges, conspiracy nightmares in American history. And you see some white people in conjunction with Negro and other slaves for burning the city of New York. Many, many people get executed as a result of this. The point I'm trying to make is there is paranoia, there is conspiracy. How do people respond to this? There's the nightmare that they were facing. How do people respond to this? If you're in New England, you're dealing with snowdrifts that are 8 feet, 10 feet deep. No ships are moving. Rich people are out in the streets begging. And it's in 1740 and 41 that as a direct outcome of this, you get this thing called the Great Awakening. Look at the ideas associated with this. You're getting all these this package of ideas coming together. Ideas of personal salvation. Soon you're getting this idea of born again, apocalyptic ideas. But the whole quality of the preaching is, I mean, you get this famous Jonathan Edwards sermon, you are totally in God's hands. God is angry. You are sinners in the hands of the angry God. He could snuff out your life at a second. You'll be in hell forever. What do you do? And there are famous accounts of people listening to this sermon and shrieking and crying. And at that point, in 1740, George Whitefield, who is sometimes called America's spiritual founding father, turns up in North America, and he begins revival meetings. And this is an era when, America has a tiny, tiny population, and he's pulling 30,000 people to revival meetings in Boston. Does that show how desperate and scared and hungry people are? They want salvation at all costs. This begins the American tradition of basically evangelicalism. You get the German ideas coming in, the Scottish ideas coming in. They've been marinating for like 50 years, but now they all come together. Whitefield is a whole story in his own right. My good friend Tommy Kidd wrote a wonderful biography of Whitefield. He was a spectacular orator, the greatest actor of the day was David Garrick. And he commented how Whitefield was such a brilliant speaker. He could bring a mob, a crowd, to tears by the way he pronounced the word Mesopotamia. He was a good speaker. And here's Mr. Whitfield again. But that starts an idea which carries on in American history. So what are these ideas? Born again, small groups, never mind what happens in the big services, small groups, field preaching, camp meetings, tent meetings, revivals. I've just described a large chunk of American history, and that grows out of these two great climate catastrophes. And we just take it on then through the next, basically right up until very modern times, right up until the age of, who is the great heir of all these traditions? Well, surely Billy Graham from the 1940s onwards. It's traditionally something that you get in southern and upland areas of the US, in areas where you find the most Scotch-Irish, those great heirs of the events of 1679. But also you get the German ideas coming in as well, Western Pennsylvania, into Tennessee, into Kentucky, and throughout the South. And soon they become national and incredibly powerful politically as well as religiously. Ulysses Grant was president around the year 1870, and he has this famous quote about he always had to deal with America's three great political parties, the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Methodists. And these ideas are going to be so important in politics because they're reflected in what? Temperance, prohibition, anti-alcohol crusades. But the roots are back in these climate disasters. There are endless pictures you will get like this. This is what, from the 1830s, 1840s. And these camp meetings will attract many, many thousands of people, and they have huge political consequences. If you want to look at the impact of like abolitionism, then it often grows out of these, a sacramental scene. And once again, let me emphasize this. There are other great climate shocks. And when you get the great climate shocks, when people are starving, when the skies are literally turning black, That's when people get to be very, very concerned about the state of their souls. And after the great volcano in 1815 in Tambora, which darkens the skies worldwide, 1817, 1818, 1819, you get a new wave of revivals. This is from, guess what, 1819. And it shows these, in this case, hundreds of people heading off to revivals. How are we doing? So, clearly, please listen to me. I'm not trying to reduce everything to, climate things, far from it. But what strikes me is if you try and tell these stories of what happens in 1680, 1740, 1819, without thinking of the climate, you're really missing a very large part of the story. And I also invite you to think, something like that is harder to imagine today because we've got our food supplies largely right in the, at least in the advanced world. In those countries that we often call, Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic, W-E-I-R-D, weird. In the weird world, we've got our food supplies right. We pretty much know we're not going to starve. We used to think we weren't going to have epidemics or pandemics. Well, that's wrong. But imagine what something like this would be in earlier societies or in global South nations today, and think how people would respond to changes like this. What would you get? Well, maybe you get new religious ideas. Maybe you would get revivals. Maybe you would get people turning out in their thousands, or even, as in contemporary Africa, in their millions, to revivals where they're looking for miracles, direct divine intervention. And there's also something I haven't really talked about, but which often results from these events, which is people start thinking they can hear the voice of God very directly. Now, not so much in the evangelical tradition, but on the fringe of that tradition. And for example, in New England, after 1815, many people lost their livelihoods. They were forced to move. They were forced to become, what's the word we use today? Climate refugees. And a lot of them moved to New York, Pennsylvania. And there's one interesting family that did that. This one I was interested in. That climate catastrophe caused a family called the Smiths to move to New York State. That revival scene I'm showing in the picture there is from 1819. Something else happened in 1819, which was the boy of the family, young Joseph Smith, claimed he had the first of his great visions. And the earliest visions were, if you like, they're a heads up, which is, great things are going to happen. Don't do certain things yet. But over the next decade, Joseph Smith develops a series of ideas where he claims to find the gold plates, talking about ancient Israelite civilizations in the Americas. And that is the basis of the Book of Mormon and the Mormon faith. Mormon faith grows out of one of these great climate movements. And interestingly, if you actually read the Book of Mormon, you will actually find some episodes that, oh brother, do they sound like they're describing the America following the Tambora volcano with the black skies and a lot of events of that era. And so I sort of ask myself whether, when you look at the world today and when you see countries that are very poorly prepared for it, facing climate shocks, I don't see any way there can't be religious consequences. If people are so used to defining themselves and their lives in religious terms, how can there not be revivals? How can there not be pleas for miracle and divine intervention? And how can there not be audiences, publics, that are willing to hear the words of new prophets? So, and of course, there will be climate refugees who really seriously want to know all about this and want to hear what the angels are proclaiming. And that is going to be what I will talk about in two weeks' time on Feb 28th, when I will talk about some of the religious impacts of contemporary catastrophes. But at the moment, what I will do is I will pull to an end there and say, okay, you want to understand the history of American religion, you look at the evangelical tradition, what evolves into holiness and Pentecostal and so on. You can look at it without looking at climate, but you're making a mistake if you do, because climate is so crucial to these pivotal moments that that drive change. And with that, I will pull to an end. I've been very good about avoiding making climate-related jokes about, coming to a stormy end or anything. But I will now ask Kevin if he will please unmute, and we can throw open for any questions that that people might have.